And you mentioned you have long experience with different government, and this conversation has been happening for so long. What are then the most persistent trade barriers between the provinces today that are still stalling it?
Well, so much of it is kind of rooted in just because it's hard. Every province has its own kind of legislation, and they've dealt with industry in a certain way. Work safe requirements, as an example, are more of a provincial jurisdiction. But then you think about it at a broader level, it's kind of because the federal government doesn't have overall responsibility for it.
Hmm.
For example, safety vests vary in terms of what has to be on a safety vest or not from province to province. Well, why would that be? So a company who actually works in more than one province has to actually have different kinds of safety vests depending on where they're doing their activities.
Okay.
It's some of those kinds of things that kind of defy logic as to, well, why wouldn't you get rid of that? And then kind of maybe at the end, there are more substantial and substantive issues that need to be negotiated between the provinces. But it's kind of getting rid of all the excess. And so that true free mobility of labor, which everyone agrees would absolutely help the
Hmm.
Canadian bottom line, would be able to be accessed.
And I mentioned off the top that obviously Ontario and Alberta just signed a memoranda of understanding yesterday where they've agreed to work towards building fresh pipelines and railways. Where can you see this sort of leading Canada on the path of again, removing those interprovincial barriers and then perhaps being less reliant on the US as a trading partner?
Well, exactly. Like, if you think about it, why on earth is it easier, well, pre-Donald Trump, to trade with the United States for Canadian businesses than it is to trade interprovincially?
Hmm.
That doesn't quite make sense. Why can't you buy BC wine in Ontario or Ontario wine in BC?
Hmm.
Why aren't we building up the Canadian kind of wine industry? Now, there's lots of reasons in the past because some industries are emerging and so they need some extra support and that kind of thing, and you want them to flourish and grow. But once they kind of get to a certain level where they are doing well, then you need to have access to other markets. And for so long, the US has been that extra market to go to
Hmm.
first rather than the rest of Canada. And so I think that that's why this opportunity of trading amongst ourselves does leave us less reliant on the US, at least in part.